From bathroom floors to boardrooms. The harsh, fluorescent lights of the San Francisco BART station bathroom flickered overhead as Chris Gardner pulled his 2-year-old son closer against his chest, whispering softly in the darkness that felt like it might swallow them both whole. The cold tile floor pressed against their bodies through the thin blanket Chris had managed to salvage from their last eviction, and the sounds of the city above echoed down through the concrete and steel like distant reminders of a world they no longer belonged to. "Daddy, where are we sleeping tonight?" little Christopher Jr. asked, with the innocent curiosity of a child who still believed his father could fix anything, solve any problem, turn any nightmare into an adventure. Chris felt his heart shatter into 1,000 pieces as he looked down at his son's trusting eyes, the same eyes that had watched their apartment door being locked behind them, the same eyes that had seen their belongings thrown into garbage bags, the same eyes that somehow still looked at him like he was a hero instead of a failure who couldn't provide the most basic necessity of shelter for his own child. "It's an adventure, buddy," Chris whispered, his voice cracking with the effort of maintaining hope when everything around them screamed of desperation and defeat. "Tomorrow, we're going to find something better. Daddy promises." It was September 1982, and Chris Gardner was 28 years old, with exactly $14 to his name, no home, no steady income, and the crushing weight of knowing that his baby son was depending on him for survival in a world that seemed designed to destroy people who started with nothing, but as Chris held Christopher Jr. Through that endless night on the bathroom floor of a subway station, something was crystallizing in his mind that would eventually transform him from a homeless father into one of Wall Street's most successful entrepreneurs. The unshakable determination that this moment, this rock bottom, this absolute devastation would not define their story. The journey to that bathroom floor had been a series of cascading disasters that seemed designed by fate to test whether Chris had any breaking point at all. Growing up in Milwaukee with an abusive stepfather and a mother who tried to shield him from violence she couldn't escape herself, Chris had learned early that survival required more than hope. It required the ability to endure pain that would cripple most people while continuing to believe that something better was possible. His childhood had been a masterclass in resilience training that he never realized he was receiving. When his stepfather's rage turned physical, Chris learned to absorb punishment without losing faith in tomorrow. When foster care separated him from everything familiar, he learned to adapt to new circumstances without losing his sense of self. When poverty meant going to bed hungry, he learned to find strength in emptiness rather than being weakened by it. "Son, you could be anything you want to be," his mother, Betty Jean, had told him during one of her lucid moments between beatings, her hands cupping his small face with tenderness that made her bruises even more heartbreaking. "Don't let anybody tell you different. You could make millions if you really wanted to." Those words had lodged themselves so deep in Chris's consciousness that even 20 years later, sitting on a subway bathroom floor with his son, they still burned with the intensity of prophecy waiting to be fulfilled. The path that had led to homelessness began with what seemed like a reasonable pursuit of the American dream. After serving in the Navy, Chris had found work as a medical salesman, selling bone density scanners to hospitals and doctors' offices across San Francisco. The job paid decently, enough to support his girlfriend Jackie and their young son, enough to maintain the illusion that they were building something stable and secure. But the medical sales industry was brutal in ways that Chris hadn't anticipated. Doctors who agreed to meetings would cancel at the last minute. Hospital administrators who expressed interest would suddenly become unreachable. Sales cycles that seemed promising would collapse without explanation, leaving Chris with commission checks too small to cover rent, utilities, and the basic necessities of supporting a family. The financial pressure created stress that infected every aspect of Chris and Jackie's relationship. Arguments about money became arguments about everything else. Late nights spent chasing reluctant customers became accusations of neglect and abandonment. The gap between what Chris was earning and what they needed to survive became a chasm that seemed to widen every month, regardless of how hard he worked or how many hours he invested. The breaking point came when Chris received a series of parking tickets while making sales calls in downtown San Francisco. Tickets he couldn't afford to pay immediately, assuming he'd handle them when his next commission check arrived. But when that check was smaller than expected, and the next one after that, the unpaid tickets accumulated interest and penalties that transformed manageable fines into a debt that seemed impossible to resolve. When the authorities finally caught up with him, Chris was arrested and sentenced to 10 days in jail for the unpaid tickets. 10 days that cost him his sales territory, his income, and ultimately his relationship with Jackie, who decided she couldn't handle the instability anymore. "I can't do this," she told him when he was released, her bags already packed and their son's toys gathered in boxes. "I can't live wondering if we'll be able to pay rent next month, wondering if you'll be arrested again, wondering if this is what the rest of our lives are going to look like." Chris watched the woman he loved and the child who meant everything to him walk out of his life, leaving him alone in an apartment he could no longer afford, with nothing but the crushing realization that everything he'd worked for had evaporated in the span of 2 weeks. But fate, it seemed, wasn't finished testing Chris Gardner's capacity for endurance. The eviction notice arrived exactly 30 days after Jackie left, typed on official letterhead that made the end of his tenancy seem as inevitable as sunrise. Chris had tried to negotiate with his landlord, explaining his situation, asking for additional time to find new income, but the real estate market in San Francisco was too competitive for landlords to take chances on tenants who couldn't guarantee payment. On the morning he was forced to leave his apartment, Chris packed everything he owned into 2 suitcases and a cardboard box, walking away from the only stable home his son had ever known, with no clear plan for what came next. The first few nights, he stayed in cheap motels, spending money he couldn't afford on rooms that provided temporary shelter, while he desperately searched for new employment. But motel rates in San Francisco, even for the seediest establishments, consumed his remaining savings faster than he had calculated, and within a week he was forced to confront a reality that seemed impossible for someone who had served his country and worked steadily for years. He was homeless. The homeless shelters in San Francisco were overcrowded, underfunded, and often more dangerous than the streets themselves. Men who had lost everything competed for cots and meals with a desperation that sometimes turned violent. The waiting lists were long, the availability unpredictable, and the environment completely unsuitable for a father trying to maintain some semblance of stability for his toddler son. So Chris improvised, the way people do when conventional solutions become unavailable. He and Christopher Jr. slept in parks when the weather permitted, in his beat-up Buick when police weren't patrolling too heavily, in 24-hour restaurants where they could nurse coffee and snacks until dawn, and increasingly often in public restrooms that provided privacy and protection from the elements. The subway bathroom became their most reliable shelter, a place where they could lock the door, have access to running water, and create a small cocoon of safety in a world that had become hostile to their very existence. Chris would spread newspapers on the floor, wrap Christopher Jr. in whatever blankets or jackets they had, and try to make their homelessness feel like an adventure rather than a catastrophe. "We're explorers," Chris would tell his son as they settled in for another night on bathroom tiles. "We're discovering all the secret places in the city that other people don't even know exist." Christopher Jr. would giggle and ask questions about their adventure, never fully understanding that they were homeless, never knowing that other children his age were sleeping in beds in rooms that belonged to them, never realizing that their situation was anything other than an elaborate game his father was playing with him. But maintaining that illusion required Chris to suppress his own despair, to transform his terror into playfulness, to find energy for hope when exhaustion and shame threatened to overwhelm him completely. Every night on that bathroom floor was a masterclass in psychological survival, a test of whether love for his son could be stronger than the humiliation of their circumstances. During the day, Chris would clean himself and Christopher Jr. up in the bathroom sink, dress in his one remaining business suit, and transform himself from homeless father into professional salesman, dropping his son off at daycare with money he could barely afford to spend, then spending 8 to 10 hours calling on potential customers who had no idea that the well-dressed man trying to sell them medical equipment had no home to return to at the end of the day. The psychological toll of maintaining this double life was extraordinary. At work, Chris had to project confidence, competence, and stability while internally calculating whether they'd be able to find shelter that night. With customers, he had to discuss long-term business relationships while knowing he had no permanent address to receive correspondence. With his son, he had to embody security and strength while feeling more vulnerable and powerless than he'd ever imagined possible. But it was during this period of absolute desperation that Chris encountered the moment that would change everything, a chance meeting that would transform his understanding of what was possible and set him on the path that would eventually make his mother's prediction about making millions come true. The red Ferrari was parked outside a brokerage firm in downtown San Francisco, gleaming in the California sunshine like a symbol of everything Chris didn't have but desperately wanted for his son. As Chris walked past on his way to another futile sales call, he noticed a well-dressed black man approaching the car with the casual confidence of someone for whom luxury was routine rather than aspiration. Something about the scene, the successful man, the expensive car, the obvious prosperity, compelled Chris to do something that would have seemed impossible just months earlier when he still had a home and steady income. He approached the stranger and asked a direct question that changed both their lives. "Excuse me, sir, what do you do for a living?" The man was Bob Bridges, a stockbroker who worked in the building behind them, and instead of dismissing Chris as an intrusive stranger, he seemed to recognize something in Chris's question, perhaps the desperate hunger of someone who needed to believe that extraordinary success was still possible, even from extraordinary circumstances. "I'm a stockbroker," Bob replied, studying Chris with the kind of attention that suggested genuine interest rather than polite obligation. I help people invest their money to make more money. Why do you ask?" Chris explained that he was looking for a career change, that he wanted to understand what it took to achieve the kind of success that Bob obviously enjoyed. What he didn't mention was that he was homeless, that his current career in medical sales was failing, that he was asking about stockbroking while having no permanent address and no financial resources to invest in retraining. But Bob saw something in Chris that transcended his immediate circumstances, perhaps the same quality that had allowed Chris to survive an abusive childhood, military service, and now homelessness, while still believing that his life could be different. "If you're serious about this," Bob said, "there are training programs. Dean Witter Reynolds has an internship that teaches people the business from the ground up. It's competitive and it doesn't pay anything during the training period, but if you're accepted and you complete it successfully, you could have a career that changes your entire life." An unpaid internship. The phrase hung in the air like both salvation and impossibility. For someone who was already homeless, the idea of working full-time without income for months seemed like financial suicide. But for someone who understood that his current trajectory led nowhere except deeper into desperation, the internship represented something more valuable than immediate income. It represented hope. That night, lying on the subway bathroom floor with Christopher Jr. sleeping peacefully in his arms, Chris made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone who understood their circumstances. He was going to apply for the Dean Witter internship, and he was going to find a way to survive the training period without income, and he was going to prove that homelessness was not his permanent condition, but simply the lowest point of a journey that would eventually lead to success beyond anything he'd previously imagined. The application process for the Dean Witter internship was designed to attract candidates who had financial stability, professional experience, and the kind of educational background that suggested natural aptitude for the complex world of securities trading. Chris had none of these qualifications in the conventional sense, but he had something potentially more valuable: the absolute desperation of someone who understood that this opportunity represented his last chance to create the kind of life he wanted for his son. The initial interview was scheduled for a Thursday morning in downtown San Francisco, and Chris prepared for it with the intensity of someone whose life depended on making an extraordinary impression. Using the bathroom facilities at the public library, he shaved carefully, styled his hair, and dressed in his one good suit with the kind of attention to detail that concealed how many nights that suit had served as a blanket. When he walked into the Dean Witter offices, Chris looked like exactly what the company was seeking: a polished, professional, motivated candidate who could represent their brand to sophisticated clients managing substantial assets. What they couldn't see was that this polished professional had spent the previous night on a bathroom floor, or that he was supporting his son on the kind of budget that required choosing between food and transportation on a daily basis. The interview went better than Chris had dared to hope. His sales experience, while unsuccessful financially, had taught him to communicate effectively with professionals. His military background had given him discipline and the ability to learn quickly under pressure. Most importantly, his life circumstances had given him a hunger for success that was palpable to everyone in the room. "Mr. Gardner," the hiring manager said at the conclusion of their meeting, "we'd like to offer you a position in our internship program. I have to warn you, though, it's 6 months with no salary, and only one person from each class typically receives a full-time offer at the end. Are you prepared for that level of commitment and uncertainty? Chris looked across the desk at the man who was offering him the chance to completely transform his life, and gave the only answer his circumstances allowed. "Yes, sir. I'm ready for whatever it takes." What Chris didn't tell them was that he was already living with more uncertainty than they could imagine, that he was already committed to survival at a level that made an unpaid internship seem manageable by comparison, that he had nothing to lose and everything to gain from taking a risk that would terrify most people. The first day of the internship introduced Chris to a world that was simultaneously familiar and completely foreign. The concepts of buying and selling weren't new to him. He'd been doing that in medical sales for years. But the scale, complexity, and stakes of securities trading were unlike anything he'd encountered. Decisions that took months in medical sales happened in minutes on Wall Street. Mistakes that cost hundreds of dollars in his previous career could cost thousands or tens of thousands in the stock market. But more challenging than the technical aspects of the training were the social dynamics that Chris had to navigate while concealing his homelessness. His fellow interns came from backgrounds that made financial stability seem natural and inevitable. They talked about their apartments, their cars, their weekend plans with the casual confidence of people who had never questioned whether they'd have a place to sleep or money for food. Chris participated in these conversations with carefully constructed responses that revealed nothing about his actual circumstances. When colleagues suggested grabbing drinks after work, he'd decline with vague references to other commitments. When they talked about their morning routines, he'd nod and smile without mentioning that his morning routine involved cleaning up in public restrooms and hoping his son's daycare wouldn't ask too many questions about why pickup times were sometimes irregular. The workload was intense by design. Dean Witter wanted to identify candidates who could handle the pressure and pace of professional trading. 12-hour days were routine. Weekend studying was expected. The material was complex enough to challenge people with advanced degrees, and the competition among interns was fierce enough that collaboration often gave way to subtle sabotage. But Chris thrived in this environment in ways that surprised even him. The skills he'd developed during years of surviving impossible circumstances, the ability to stay calm under pressure, to find solutions when conventional approaches failed, to maintain focus when everything around him was chaotic, translated perfectly to the world of securities trading. More importantly, the desperation that drove him to succeed was qualitatively different from the ambition that motivated his fellow interns. They wanted to succeed. Chris needed to succeed. They were pursuing career advancement. Chris was pursuing survival for himself and his son. They were motivated by the possibility of wealth and status. Chris was motivated by the certainty that failure would mean returning to bathroom floors and homeless shelters. The daily routine became a carefully choreographed performance that required Chris to excel at his internship while managing homelessness and single parenthood simultaneously. He would wake up at 5 a.m. wherever they had slept the night before, get himself and Christopher Jr. cleaned up and dressed, drop his son at daycare, arrive at Dean Witter by 7 a.m., looking like he'd spent the morning in his own apartment, preparing for success. During lunch breaks, instead of eating with colleagues, Chris would make phone calls to homeless shelters, trying to secure beds for that evening. After work, instead of joining colleagues for drinks or networking events, he would pick up Christopher Jr. and begin the evening routine of finding food and shelter, maintaining the adventure narrative that kept his son's spirits up, while privately calculating how long they could sustain this impossible lifestyle. The physical exhaustion was manageable. Chris had been tired before. The emotional strain was more challenging, maintaining optimism for his son while privately confronting the possibility that the internship might not lead to employment, that 6 months of unpaid work might simply extend their homelessness without creating the financial stability they desperately needed. But the psychological pressure was most difficult of all. The knowledge that every day at Dean Witter was both an opportunity to change their lives and a risk that could leave them worse off than before. If Chris failed the internship, he would have invested 6 months in training that provided no income and no guarantees. If he succeeded, but wasn't selected for a full-time position, he would still be homeless, but would have used up 6 months of time and energy that could have been spent on other survival strategies. The midpoint of the internship brought a crisis that tested every survival skill Chris had developed over the previous year. Christopher Jr. became seriously ill with a fever that wouldn't break, requiring medical attention they couldn't afford, and forcing Chris to miss several days of training at the worst possible moment in the program. Sitting in the emergency room with his sick son, Chris confronted the possibility that their entire plan might collapse just when success seemed within reach. Missing critical training sessions could result in dismissal from the program. Hospital bills could consume what little money they had managed to save. Most devastatingly, Christopher Jr.'s illness forced Chris to confront how their living situation was affecting his son's health and development. "Daddy," Christopher Jr. said weakly from the hospital bed, "when are we going to have our own room again?" The question hit Chris like a physical blow, forcing him to recognize that his son was beginning to understand that their adventures weren't temporary, that other children lived differently, that homelessness was becoming their normal rather than their emergency. That night, as Chris sat beside his son's hospital bed, he made a promise that would fuel everything that followed. "Buddy, I promise you that we're going to have our own place soon. Not just a room, our own home, and nobody will ever be able to take it away from us again." The promise wasn't just to Christopher Jr. It was to himself, a commitment that he would find the strength to continue fighting even when fighting felt impossible, even when the odds seemed designed to destroy people who started with nothing. When Chris returned to Dean Witter after his son's recovery, his performance shifted from competent to exceptional. The near miss with losing everything had clarified his priorities and intensified his focus. Every lesson became critical knowledge for building the life he'd promised his son. Every successful trade became proof that success was possible despite their circumstances. Every day that passed without getting fired from the program became a victory against the forces that seemed determined to keep them on bathroom floors forever. The other interns began to notice Chris's intensity, the way he absorbed information like someone whose life depended on it, the way he approached every assignment as if it were the most important task in the world. Some attributed it to natural ambition. Others assumed he had financial pressures they couldn't see. None of them guessed that their colleague was literally homeless, that his motivation came from the knowledge that success in the program meant the difference between homelessness and stability for his child. As the internship approached its conclusion, the competition among interns intensified. Dean Witter traditionally hired only one person from each training class, meaning that 19 highly motivated, well-trained candidates would be rejected despite months of unpaid work. The final evaluations would be based on test scores, performance assessments, and intangible qualities like cultural fit and future potential that were difficult to measure and impossible to predict. Chris approached the final phase of the program with the same systematic intensity he'd brought to every other survival challenge he'd faced. He studied harder than his competitors because he had more to lose. He prepared more thoroughly because preparation was the only advantage he could control. Most importantly, he maintained the performance that had concealed his homelessness for 6 months, ensuring that his personal circumstances wouldn't influence his professional evaluation. The day the decision was announced remains etched in Chris's memory with the clarity that comes with life-changing moments. The managing director called all the interns into the conference room, his expression revealing nothing about what he was about to say. "This was an exceptional class," he began, "and we wish we could offer positions to all of you. Unfortunately, we can only hire one intern this cycle." The silence in the room was thick with tension, anticipation, and the knowledge that 19 dreams were about to be shattered, while one person's life was about to be transformed. "Chris Gardner, we'd like to offer you a full-time position as a stockbroker with Dean Witter Reynolds." The words hit Chris with such force that he had to grip his chair to keep from collapsing with relief, joy, and the overwhelming realization that everything was about to change. After a year of homelessness, after countless nights on bathroom floors, after maintaining hope when hope seemed irrational, he had not only survived, but prevailed. That evening, Chris picked up Christopher Jr. from daycare with news that would change both their lives forever. "Buddy, Daddy got the job. We're going to have our own place, our own room, and we're never going to sleep in bathrooms again." The transition from homeless intern to employed stockbroker happened quickly, but felt surreal after months of uncertainty. Dean Witter provided Chris with a starting salary that, while modest by stockbroking standards, represented more financial security than he'd had since before Christopher Jr.'s birth. More importantly, steady income meant the ability to rent an apartment, establish routines, and begin building the stable life he'd promised his son. The first apartment was small, basic, and located in a neighborhood that most of Chris's colleagues would have considered beneath their standards. But to Chris and Christopher Jr., it was a palace, a place with their own beds, their own kitchen, their own bathroom that they didn't have to share with strangers or lock behind them for protection. "This is ours," Christopher Jr. asked the first night they slept in their own beds, his voice filled with wonder at the concept of permanence. "This is ours," Chris confirmed, tucking his son into a bed that belonged to them in a room that couldn't be taken away by eviction notices or parking tickets, or any of the disasters that had destroyed their stability before. But securing housing was only the first step in Chris's plan to build the kind of success that would ensure Christopher Jr. never experience poverty again. The stockbroking industry offered unlimited income potential for people willing to work harder and smarter than their competition, and Chris approached his new career with the same intensity that had carried him through homelessness. He arrived at the office earlier than anyone else, studying market reports and client portfolios before the business day began. He stayed later than his colleagues, making phone calls to potential clients on the West Coast when East Coast markets had closed. Most importantly, he treated every client interaction as an opportunity to prove that their trust in him would be rewarded with exceptional service and superior results. The sales skills Chris had developed during his unsuccessful medical career translated perfectly to securities trading, but with one crucial difference. Now he was selling products he believed in to clients who could benefit significantly from his expertise. Instead of trying to convince reluctant doctors to buy equipment they didn't need, he was helping motivated investors build wealth through strategies that created genuine value. The income growth was dramatic and immediate. Within 6 months of being hired, Chris was earning more money than he'd ever imagined possible. Within a year, he was one of Dean Witter's top performers, generating commissions that allowed him to move Christopher Jr. to better schools, live in better neighborhoods, and begin building the financial security that would protect them from ever being homeless again. But Chris's ambitions extended far beyond personal financial security. The experience of homelessness had taught him that individual success, while necessary, wasn't sufficient. He wanted to build wealth at a scale that would allow him to help other people escape the circumstances that had nearly destroyed his family. The entrepreneurial opportunity came when Chris realized that his success at Dean Witter was being limited by company policies and bureaucratic constraints that prevented him from serving clients as effectively as he wanted to. Instead of accepting those limitations, he made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. He would start his own investment firm. Gardner, Rich & Company was founded in 1987 with Chris as the sole employee, operating out of a small office that reflected his commitment to rebuilding from the ground up rather than trying to appear established before earning that status. The company name reflected both his personal journey and his commitment to helping clients achieve genuine wealth rather than just financial security. The early days of running his own firm brought challenges that were different from homelessness, but equally demanding. Chris had to attract clients without the credibility that came with working for an established firm. He had to compete against companies with decades of history, substantial marketing budgets, and teams of experienced professionals. Most challengingly, he had to prove that a man who had been homeless just 5 years earlier could be trusted with managing significant wealth for sophisticated investors. But Chris's unique background proved to be an asset rather than a liability in ways he hadn't anticipated. Clients were impressed by his story, not just because it was inspirational, but because it demonstrated the kind of determination and resilience that translated into exceptional performance under pressure. When markets became volatile or investments performed poorly, clients wanted advisors who had proven they could navigate extreme adversity without losing focus or abandoning their commitments. Gardner, Rich & Company grew steadily through a combination of exceptional client service, consistent performance, and Chris's ability to connect with people who appreciated authenticity over conventional credentials. Within 5 years, the firm was managing hundreds of millions of dollars in assets for clients who valued Chris's unique perspective on building and preserving wealth. The financial success allowed Chris to fulfill promises he'd made to himself and Christopher Jr. during their homeless period. They moved to progressively better neighborhoods, eventually settling in homes that provided not just comfort, but genuine luxury. Christopher Jr. attended private schools that ensured he would have educational opportunities his father had never imagined possible. Most importantly, Chris began accumulating the kind of wealth that would protect his family from financial instability, regardless of what economic disasters might affect their industries or investments. By the time Christopher Jr. was in high school, Chris had achieved a level of financial success that exceeded his mother's prediction about making millions. Gardner Rich and Company was managing over $1 billion in assets, generating annual revenues that placed Chris among the most successful entrepreneurs in the financial services industry. His personal net worth had grown to levels that seemed impossible to the man who had once counted $14 as his entire fortune. But the numbers, impressive as they were, didn't capture the most meaningful aspects of Chris's transformation. The man who had whispered promises to his son on bathroom floors had kept every commitment, creating not just wealth, but genuine security for the child who had trusted him during their darkest moments. The media attention that came with Chris's success brought opportunities to share his story with audiences around the world who needed to hear that extraordinary circumstances didn't have to produce ordinary outcomes. Speaking engagements, book deals, and eventually the Hollywood movie based on his life allowed Chris to inspire millions of people who were facing their own versions of bathroom floors and impossible circumstances. The Pursuit of Happyness, starring Will Smith, introduced Chris's story to audiences who had never heard of Gardner Rich and Company, but could relate to the universal themes of persistence, parental love, and the refusal to accept defeat as permanent. The movie's success brought Chris international recognition and additional opportunities to mentor entrepreneurs, support homeless families, and demonstrate that success was possible for anyone willing to endure temporary defeats in pursuit of permanent victories. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition of Chris's journey came from Christopher Jr., who had grown from the toddler who slept on bathroom floors into a successful adult who understood that his father's love had been demonstrated not just through words, but through the willingness to sacrifice everything to create better circumstances for both of them. "Dad," Christopher Jr. said during one of their conversations about the old days, "I want you to know that even when we were sleeping in bathrooms, I never doubted that you would figure out a way to make things better. I always felt safe because I knew you would never give up." Those words represented the true measure of Chris's success, not the millions of dollars he had earned or the company he had built, but the fact that his son had grown up believing that love and determination could overcome any obstacle, that temporary circumstances didn't define permanent possibilities, that fathers who promised better futures were capable of delivering on those promises. Today, Chris Gardner's net worth exceeds $60 million, and Gardner Rich and Company continues to manage substantial assets for clients who value both financial expertise and the unique perspective that comes from understanding wealth as security rather than status. But when Chris reflects on his journey from bathroom floors to boardrooms, he focuses on lessons that transcend financial success. "Homelessness taught me that everything else is manageable," he explains to audiences of entrepreneurs and business leaders. "When you've held your child on a bathroom floor and promised him that things will get better, every other challenge seems solvable by comparison. When you've proven to yourself that love can be stronger than desperation, you understand that any goal is achievable if you're willing to pay the price that success demands." The man who once whispered, "It's an adventure," to his son in subway bathrooms had proven that the most devastating circumstances can become the foundation for the most extraordinary achievements. He had demonstrated that success isn't about avoiding hardship, but about transforming hardship into strength. that wealth isn't about accumulating money, but about creating security, and that the greatest adventures often begin in the places that feel most like endings. From $14 and a bathroom floor to $60 million and international recognition, Chris Gardner's story proves that American dreams aren't reserved for people who start with advantages. They're available to anyone who refuses to accept defeat as permanent, who transforms desperation into determination, and who understands that the most powerful motivation comes from love for the people who depend on us to never give up. The question isn't whether you'll face moments that feel like bathroom floors. The question is whether you will have the courage to whisper promises in the darkness, the strength to keep those promises when keeping them seems impossible, and the faith to believe that adventure and transformation are always possible for people who refuse to accept their current circumstances as their final destination.